Hola, soalnya doya kapso.
To read a passage from the sutras. You can find this verse in the Lalita Vistara, or the play in full, as it's titled in English. The Buddha said, profound, peaceful, stainless, lucid, and unconditioned. Such is the nectar-like truth that I have realized. Were I to teach it, no one would understand, so I will silently remain in the forest. So this is said to be the first words the Buddha spoke after he achieved full enlightenment. The first line is profound, peaceful, stainless, lucid, and unconditioned. So this line is principally indicating the two truths by profound, and sometimes it says stainless, other times it says free of elaborations. Geshe's reading of it is actually free of elaborations. Of course, that indicates emptiness, the emptiness of true existence, the emptiness of inherent existence and existence by way of one's own characteristics.
Hmm.
By lucid, or more literally, clear light, this probably alludes to the clear light mind of Tantra, indicated in Tantra. So essentially, by stating this, the Buddha is saying, I have achieved the final state of Buddhahood, endowed with the four bodies. I have something to teach. I'm here for sentient beings, for their benefit, to help them tame their afflictions and overcome them. But who would understand what I have to say? So therefore, I will stay quietly in the forest without speaking. So this was taught in Bodh Gaya. The Buddha achieved enlightenment in Bodh Gaya and came there to teach. But at that time, he declared that no one would understand what he has to teach. That's
Hmm.
So remaining in that silent state in the forest, multiple gods such as Brahma and Shakra and so forth requested the Buddha to please teach, please turn the wheel of Dharma. But at that time, the Buddha saw that there were no intended disciples for such profound teachings as that. So he went to Varanasi and he came upon his previous five companions and he taught to them the Four Noble Truths, starting with, this is the truth of suffering. At that time in India, and of course all throughout the world, everybody was suffering, just as they are now. And the Buddha was completely aware of this situation, this pervasive situation. And he declared this state to them. All beings are suffering because they have not tamed their minds, because they cherish themselves more than others, are only preoccupied with their own happiness, and couldn't care less about anybody else. So, seeing this situation that everybody was in, he said, this is the truth of suffering, and presented the Four Noble Truths, which are essentially a summary of all the teachings. And with regard to the first noble truth, the truth of suffering, it's also said in Sutra that he phrased it as suffering should be known. And having known suffering, it does not need to be known, which means that once you understand it, you don't need to understand it multiple times. You've got it. So, as a summary, Geshe asking, what is the point of studying the Four Noble Truths? What is so important about it that it's worth knowing? Well, if you think of 7 billion people on this earth, who among them understand the Four Noble Truths? Or putting aside understanding it, who among them have even heard about them? And who among them have some sort of practice based on their understanding? That's incredibly rare to find anybody who has any of those characteristics.
Mm.
With respect to practicing the Four Noble Truths, we should consider how it's actually beneficial to ourselves in this lifetime. Let's bring the practice of the Four Noble Truths down to this very lifetime. We live in a society, right? Um, we have rules and laws we need to follow. And if we don't follow the laws of society, it's not good for ourselves. It's not good for everybody as a whole, right? We should all be working together to lift each other up and not bring each other down. So thinking of practicing the Four Noble Truths in terms of bringing some happiness and welfare within this lifetime. We shouldn't approach our existence within a society of thinking, how can I get the most advantages for myself through living in a society? How can I come to power over all other people and get to the top? Rather, we should be thinking, I live in a society, and in a society, we all need to get along and be nice to each other. If we're friendly with each other, then in times of hardship, others will come to our aid. Well, approaching life on the basis of the Four Noble Truths can also bring about these general positive interactions and effect. Not only is it the practice of the Four Noble Truths the most advantageous for achieving Buddhahood, but also just as a general approach or philosophy in this lifetime to achieve uh, balance and happiness within society. That's
Mm.
The Buddha's teachings are entirely for the purpose of taming our own minds. It's very clear that if we do not tame our own minds, we're harming not only ourselves, but we bring about harm towards others. And that all problems we face in society can be linked back to our minds not being tamed. In the most coarse example, we can think of the wars that are waged even in the world right now. Wars come about and are caused by us not taming, having tamed minds, right? Wars don't happen or aren't waged by the trees in the forest or the mountains or inanimate objects in the environment. Wars are waged by us due to our attachment and our anger. So think of the suffering that our untamed minds bring about. Imagine if we were caught up in a war, how horrible that would be. And therefore, the Buddha first taught to his disciples suffering, said, this is suffering. You need to understand it. This is something we experience 24/7 at all times, but we can't recognize it. Just as a very small example off the top of my head, for example, we get up in the morning and we're happy, and then eventually we get to the office and we see all this work that's piled up waiting for us, and our mindset changes. We get sad. That's just day-to-day reality. Just a small example. In fact, whatever activity we do, whether we're going, we're staying, whether we're eating, all these activities eventually transform into suffering again because their nature is suffering. And of course, this is just a presentation of coarse suffering. Now to delve into a little bit more detail with respect to this statement, understand suffering. With respect to each noble truth, there are posited four aspects. And with respect to the first noble truth of suffering, we need to understand the four aspects that are associated with them, and also how we wrongly perceive those four aspects as their opposite. So with true sufferings, every true suffering has the aspect of being impermanent, miserable, empty, and selfless. So Geshe's order that he gave was actually not the common order, but it's important because he's explaining it in this order. He explains it as empty, selfless, impermanent, and suffering. So starting with the first, it can also be explained in this way, that our body, for example, as an illustration of a true suffering, is unclean, but we wrongly apprehend that as its opposite, as being clean or pure. In fact, our body is established from the blood and the ovum of the mother and the semen of the father. It's by nature, from its inception, it is impure. So we can't see inside our own bodies. And therefore, at all times, we're not perceiving how gross and disgusting they actually are. Instead, we're seeing them from the outside and thinking, that's so great. My body's so clean. And we get attached to our body in this way and have a wrong perception or a wrong engagement of that aspect of the body. And then with respect to the aspect of suffering or misery, we apprehend that it is bliss or happiness. All illustrations of true sufferings are by nature suffering, but we hold them as pleasurable. But if true sufferings were actually pleasurable, then they would have to bring about pleasure at all times, 24/7. As much as you engage with them, they should bring about pleasure, but they don't. As I said before, in the morning you get up, you experience some happiness, but that happiness always turns back into suffering at some point. So there is no stable happiness. Every illustration of true sufferings is by nature a suffering. With respect to the third aspect, it is said that all compounded phenomena are impermanent. So our body, likewise, being a compounded phenomena, is impermanent. But the way it appears to us is that it is remaining as it is for a long time. And this thought that it is just staying the way it is, not changing, is what is called as the apprehension of permanence. Every compounded phenomena from their arising are in the nature of disintegration, right? From merely arising, everything is in the nature of disintegrating. But of course, to our minds, everything looks like it is remaining without change and staying exactly how it was. But everything is changing on a momentary basis. From second to second, things are undergoing change. And that goes for everything in the world. Look at the flowers outside, for example. Every single second, they're undergoing change. And therefore, by the minute, by the hour, day, week, of course, they are changing. But with respect to ourselves, we perceive that we remain, we don't change for years on end. We have this perception of ourselves as stable. And this is called the innate apprehension of permanence, which must be abandoned. So to counter this, you should contemplate how you change second to second.
Mm-hmm.
Then with respect to the final aspect of selflessness, Geshe, let's reverse the order from his original explanation. But traditionally, the final aspect given of true suffering is selflessness. And of course, selflessness is a fundamental concept within Buddhism. So with respect to how it's explained in the context of the first noble truth, we do not have a self. The self does not exist, but we have an innate apprehension of an I in spite of that. And that leads to attachment to a self, an attachment to a self that seemingly does not depend at all on the aggregates to exist. So, despite there not being such a self, we always apprehend one. But if you search for such a self that is independent of one's own aggregates, it cannot be found. Whatever we do, we always carry this perception with us. I am going, I am eating, I am drinking. At all times, it's just I. So at one point in Mundgot, where Geshe's monastery is based, there was a, a big meeting between scientists and the monks there, and His Holiness was present, along with many great scientists, mostly Americans. And one of the American scientists was giving his presentation to us, and he said, I've studied many hundreds of people, and I tried to correlate their speech wherein they would talk about themselves with certain negative effects. And in my studies, I noted a correlation between those who always say I, and an increase in blood pressure. So that's quite interesting, isn't it? Those who are more likely to talk in the sense of this I, use that sort of phrasing, are more likely to have higher blood pressure. So think about your own self. When you say I, what are you referring to? Do you find it when you look for it? For example, if I'm tashi-tering, where am I? Is the tashi in the head? Is it in the hands, in the legs? Where is this tashi? Of course, it's not found, and therefore it is said when you search for the basis of imputation, you don't find it. You can also think of it with respect to a car, for example. Where is what we call the car? Is it in the wheels? Is it in the steering wheel? Is it in the chassis? Well, it's none of those things. And therefore, this I is simply imputed onto the collection of the aggregates. And that wraps up our presentation of the four aspects of true sufferings. So to recap, we have an apprehension of our body, for example, which is unclean as being clean. And we need to do away with that apprehension. And we do away with it by contemplating that the body is unclean by nature, and of course, under the control of karma and afflictions. And then the second was apprehending suffering as happiness. But happiness is always temporary, and therefore we should not get so attached to our happiness as something so great because it always turns back into suffering. And thus we counteract that wrong thought of um, apprehending sufferings as happiness. Then the third aspect, apprehending what is impermanent to be permanent. Of course, applying that to our body, we shouldn't think that it is permanent and remains, and we should counter that idea by contemplating how it disintegrates. And then the fourth aspect of selflessness, we should understand the faults of grasping at a self and strive to abandon self-grasping. So these more refined and detailed explanations are actually what you find when you do more in-depth study of the greater treatises within our tradition. It is really difficult to wrap your head around it, but we can't shy away from difficult topics just because it takes longer to grasp them. We should listen to such presentations and start to place imprints in our mind for understanding them. So we've looked a little bit at what is said in the sutras about the Four Noble Truths. So the words of the Buddha himself. Of course, on top of that, there are also many statements in the canonical commentaries on those sutras. So just to use one as an example, we have Maitreya's words in his Uttara Tantra or Sublime Continuum. And a wonderful analogy is given in a passage from the Uttara Tantra, which reads, recognize that you are ill, eliminate the cause of the illness, attain health, rely on a remedy. Likewise, you should recognize, eliminate, attain, and rely upon suffering, its cause, its cessation, and the path, respectively. So this is a brilliant analogy through which we can understand the Four Noble Truths. The verse starts off with, recognize that you are ill. Of course, illness is being used as an analogy for true sufferings. So, as an example in our life, we get sick, we experience heat and pain and so forth. All examples for true suffering. And then Maitreya says, eliminate the cause of the illness. So the cause of an illness, of course, is an analogy of true origins. Then Maitreya says, attain health, rely on a remedy. So having understood the cause of the illness, which is true origins, right? We need to attain a state of health, which is an analogy for true cessations. In order to achieve true cessations, which are in their highest aspect, the complete abandonment of those things which need to be abandoned on the path of meditation. One needs to cultivate a path, right? So the medicine or the remedy that we need to cultivate is the path. The suffering that we have to experience in this very lifetime has come about through the karma, the lots of karma and bad karma at that, that we have accumulated in previous lifetimes. So understanding that suffering comes about in this way through this causal relationship, the Buddha said, this is the origins. And he made it clear that the origins are karma and afflictions. So we need to identify these karma and afflictions that are the origins of true sufferings. And having identified them and abandoned them, there is nothing left to abandon. So in Sutra, the Buddha said, after he stated, having understood suffering, there is nothing left to understand. Having abandoned the origins, there is nothing left to abandon. So this abandonment of the origins is the attainment of liberation, which is a cessation. Because we're Buddhists, we do not assert a creator God. Now, there are many different religions in the world, probably over 100, and quite a lot of them, if not most of them, believe in a God and the kind of God that creates everything in this world. For example, certain Hindu sects assert that there is a creator God who not only created the world, but everything in it. And nothing is created by people. But in Buddhism, we don't assert a creator God. So our explanation for what arises in the world is different. We assert that everything arises through causes and conditions that are impermanent. And not only impermanent causes, but compatible causes of similar type. So if things could arise from incompatible causes, you could give a random example of like a cat being able to produce a dog. This is impossible, it's ridiculous. It's just an example of the logical consequence of incompatible causes producing uh, incompatible effects. Of course, we don't believe in this. We believe all of our suffering, right, our main concern, is produced from compatible causes, which are the true origins we identify as karma and afflictions. So it's important to know this because in order to abandon the causes of our suffering, we need to identify them. And we need to understand that we need to eliminate them completely in order for suffering to stop arising. For example, if there's a poisonous tree outside in your field, if you want to get rid of it, you don't start plucking off its leaves or cutting off some of the branches. You need to completely uproot it. And that's exactly the way we talk about true origins here. They need to be completely uprooted for them to stop producing suffering. Once again.
mm,
Well, if true origins are the cause of true sufferings, what are true origins? Is it things we find in our environment, rocks, water, dirt, and so forth? No, those are not origins for suffering. The origins for suffering are included within our own continuum. They are our own karma and afflictions. These are what we identify as true origins. It is through those that we take up rebirth within samsara. Well, then the question comes, what is samsara? If you really point to an example. What is it? Is Singapore samsara? Is it my house? What is it? Well, technically speaking, Singapore would be considered a samsaric abode. If you really want to posit samsara specifically in accordance with the examples given in the greater treatises in our tradition, they point to the contaminated, appropriated aggregates as being the real example of samsara. Thus, all the suffering that we experience is experienced on the basis of our aggregates, and therefore we identify these aggregates as samsara. So, for example, our form aggregate, right? Our body. If you get an injection or you get hurt, you experience pain on the basis of that. And then, of course, our aggregate of consciousness is a basis for experiencing anxiety, fears, paranoias, all of these terrible mind states that come up for us day to day. So if you think of all of them in their collection, they are what go from lifetime to lifetime. That is the basis of taking rebirth, right? It's an endless cycle upon which they are the basis for our experience of suffering. Therefore, they are really samsara. Therefore, in Buddhism, the presentation is such that we have to take birth, and then we have to die, and then we have to cycle through this process endlessly again and again. According to other religions, it's a little bit of a shorter process. Most other religions believe that when you die, you don't take rebirth again. Um, you either go to heaven or hell, but the process sort of finishes there. Scientists at present haven't established any sort of continuation after death. So, from most scientific standpoints, you die and that's it. Nothing. But in Buddhism, you die and then you're reborn and then you cycle like this forever. And you don't have control, 100% control over where you go after you die. You're under the control and propelled by your own karma and afflictions into the next life. But if we can abandon the grasping at a self, which is the root of this perpetual cycling, then we can abandon a samsara that is by nature suffering. Other beings, for example, bodhisattvas, Nagarjuna, and other masters, they enter into samsara, but they don't enter into it through karma and afflictions. And on top of that, they don't undergo suffering when they are in this samsaric abode.
mm,
When we're dead, we get cremated, for example. But the mind is not cremated. The mind goes on. When we die, our organs shut down, and therefore the consciousnesses associated with those organs, the eye consciousness, ear consciousness, and so forth, they cease at that time, but the mental consciousness goes on. So one can consider the mind as like a tenant within these aggregates that we're temporarily renting. So we leave behind our rental house and the consciousness goes on after death, according to Buddhism. So true origins are divided into true origins that are karmas and true origins that are afflictions. So because these are causing our rebirth in samsara, we need to identify them. So what are these karmas that are causing us to cycle in samsara? What are these afflictions that are causing us to cycle in samsara? As for the karmas, in the Lam Rim, for example, uh, one can posit the 10 non-virtues. Well, it posits the 10 non-virtues as an example. With respect to the afflictions, in the Lam Rim Chamo, you get a presentation of the 10, which are the 5 non-views and the 5 views. So as presented by Tsongkhapa, in the Lam Rim Chamo, the 5 non-views that are the afflictions in this context are attachment, hostility, pride, ignorance, and doubt. And the 5 views are the reifying view of the perishing aggregates, an extremist view, a belief in the supremacy of wrong views, a belief in the supremacy of wrong ethics and religious discipline, and wrong views. So those make up 10 in total afflictions in this context.
Mm.
Tsongkhapa posits in his great treatise on the stages of the path a general definition for afflictions and a specific definition. So he quotes Asanga's Compendium of Knowledge for his general definition of afflictions. And Asanga defines it as a phenomenon that when it arises, it is disturbing in character. And through arising, it disturbs the mind stream. So essentially, an affliction is something that when it arises, it makes us unhappy. Essentially, whatever previous happiness was there in our mind, it turns that into suffering through a process of disturbance.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so with respect to the more specific definition of the afflictions, Geshe quoted a passage which I don't have, so apologies for that. I can't repeat that to you. But anyway, it basically gets into the specifics of the individual afflictions. So starting with attachment, it is, if not the worst among them. It ruins us essentially. Attachment gives rise to inappropriate attention, as it's called, which focuses on either internal or external objects and gives rise to a craving of them. So, for example, uh, most of us are attached to our bodies, and this gives rise to an attachment to clothings and self-image, attachment to food and drink and so forth. And attachment itself is a very dangerous affliction because it is said in the great treatises that it is what prevents us from being disenchanted with samsara. It prevents us from giving rise to a attitude of renunciation towards samsara. So for this reason, it is one of the worst. In Vasubandhu's Treasury of Knowledge, Geshe believes it's the 6th chapter. He presents the antidotes to the afflictions. For the antidote to attachment, he presents meditation on the unpleasant. And then he gives the antidote to, there's this word in Tibetan that I always have trouble translating. I always like to leave it in Tibetan, but I need to provide you with an English word. But this what, if you allow me 1 second. Right, so like an overactive imagination or just discursive thought, I guess it's how we normally say it. Namdok. He presents as an antidote to that, just counting the breath, which calms the mind and stops all this discursive thinking. So these are quite powerful. If we meditate on unpleasant aspects, it can reduce our attachment, which is constantly disturbing our mind. So types of attachment that it can reduce are, for example, just general attachment that people have to each other, like boys and girls being attached to each other, or an attachment to our body that leads to negative self-image that makes us sad. It can help us overcome these things. So normally we think that the body is so clean, it's so great, looks great from the outside, but instead we're told to reflect on its nature of being a skeleton, blood and pus and so forth. And that sort of calms down and reduces our attachment. And Geshe says he believes this presentation is in liberation of the in the palm of one's hand, where one is told to meditate on the body as being a vessel for 36 different impure substances. Geshe said he can't remember the meditation exactly, but that's also a very powerful meditation. And then, as just mentioned, Vasubandhu goes on to give the antidote to our discursive thinking, which is counting the breath, for example, which can really calm us down and stop our mind wandering everywhere, which is also an obstacle for us to being able to stay single-pointedly on the object of meditation. So these sorts of antidotal meditations aren't too hard, are they? They're not too bad. So you should follow up on them, look at their presentations, and engage in those meditations. The next affliction that is addressed in the list of 10 is hostility or anger. And this is another horrible affliction. In the scriptures, it said that if you accumulate karma through your anger, then that karma can propel rebirth in a lower state, such as hell, for example. So, on the basis of anger, we accumulate such horrible karma, which leads to terrible rebirths. Um, by nature, uh, it is a harsh and tormented state of mind. It is a hostile state of mind, which leads to not liking others just from seeing them with no real reason. You develop this hostility towards other people and also not just people. It's quite ridiculous. We can get angry at objects as well, which makes even less sense. For example, people start throwing things or they slam their car door because they're angry at their car, for example. Right? It makes us behave completely irrationally. So we definitely need to reduce our anger at all costs because it leads to the accumulation of such horrible karma. So to reduce it, the antidote that we meditate on is patience, and this will all be explained later in more detail, but just briefly now. It's good to, as much as we can, meditate on patience and also to give rise, to try as much as we can to give rise to a bit more compassion towards others rather than letting our anger surface and running away with it. So in Shantideva's Bodhisattva's Way of Life, for example, he tells us all the horrible results of anger. And he says, one of the worst things that it can do is destroy all of your roots of virtue. And Geshe said, for example, if you get really, really angry today, it can destroy all of your roots of virtue that you've accumulated for today. Now, how horrible that would be. So please try as much as you can to reduce your anger. So we're out of time, but for our next session, we're going to primarily look at true cessations. Of course, we didn't finish true origins today, so we might pick up by finishing that in the next session. So to just recap on true sufferings that the Buddha taught, please reflect on it like follows. We have these true sufferings in our own continuum. Every state of unhappiness that you go through from day to day is a true suffering. Please learn to identify those as such. And then when they come up, get yourself in the habit of thinking, where does this unhappiness come from? And try to link it back to its origins, which are karma and affliction. So, in this way, please try to identify all of your unhappy states as true sufferings, and then try as much as you can through your understanding to prevent them from arising.